Disclaimer: this story is inspired by real-life themes, but is presented here as a narrative for entertainment purposes only. It does not intend to offend, encourage inappropriate behavior, or cross moral boundaries. The night began like any other work party, but as the hours passed, I found myself caught in a blur of conversations, clinking glasses, and laughter that grew louder with every round. I was never much of a drinker, yet the encouragement of my colleagues, combined with the pressure to appear sociable, left me sipping more than I should have. By the time the party began winding down, the warmth of the alcohol had turned into a heaviness in my head. My steps faltered slightly as I made my way toward the exit, trying to hold on to whatever dignity I could muster. The air outside was cooler, a welcome relief against my flushed skin, but the dizziness lingered. I remember fumbling with my phone, debating whether to call a cab or just walk for a while to clear my thoughts. My husband wasn't home that night. He often worked late, and our schedules rarely aligned. It was one of the many silent rifts in our marriage, something I had grown used to but never truly accepted. That emptiness pressed harder on nights like these, when the world spun a little too fast and I longed for someone steady to lean on. As I stepped forward, I caught sight of a familiar figure leaning against a car nearby. For a second, I thought the alcohol was playing tricks on me. But no, it was him. My husband's son. Taller than I remembered, his presence was both surprising and unsettling. Our relationship had always been polite but distant, shaped more by circumstance than choice. He looked at me with a mixture of recognition and hesitation, as though unsure whether to approach. I felt my cheeks heat up, not just from the wine, but from the awkwardness of being seen in this state. Of all people, why him? Yet, before I could retreat or hide behind a forced smile, he walked toward me. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his tone steady but cautious. I wanted to answer confidently, but the slight stumble in my step betrayed me. There was a brief silence, the kind that carries unspoken thoughts. He wasn't supposed to be here, and neither was I, not like this. I managed a faint laugh, brushing off my clumsiness with a wave of my hand. "Just a little too much celebrating," I muttered, though my voice lacked conviction. He nodded, his eyes studying me with concern that felt both protective and intrusive. At that moment, the night shifted. What began as an ordinary work gathering had turned into something unexpected, something I hadn't prepared for. Standing there, under the dim glow of the streetlights, I realized this was not just an accidental meeting. It was the beginning of an evening that would test the fragile boundaries of our family ties and of my own heart. He stood there for a moment, as if weighing his options, before finally deciding to close the gap between us. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though he didn't want to startle me or make me feel cornered. I noticed the way his eyes flickered, unsure whether to meet mine or look away. Perhaps he was thinking the same thing I was, that this was an encounter we never expected, never imagined, and certainly never rehearsed. "Do you need a ride home?" he asked after a pause. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of unease. I tried to wave him off, insisting that I could manage, but my words slurred slightly. My attempt at independence only made my vulnerability more obvious. He didn't press, yet the hesitation in his eyes revealed the conflict he was feeling. Helping me seemed like the right thing to do, but the situation was undeniably complicated. I felt my heart quicken, not from attraction, but from embarrassment. I had always prided myself on keeping a certain image in front of him, composed, responsible, someone who could handle herself. But now, under the harsh honesty of the streetlights, that facade crumbled. I was just a woman who had drunk too much and stumbled into the one person she least expected to see. He glanced around, as if checking whether anyone else was watching, then said, "It's not safe for you to walk like this. Let me help you." The firmness in his tone left little room for protest. For a brief second, I thought of calling my husband, but I knew the call would go unanswered. The thought of waiting on a cold sidewalk for a cab felt unbearable. Against my pride, I nodded, allowing him to take the lead. As we moved toward his car, I noticed the way he kept a careful distance, respectful but alert. He wasn't intrusive, yet his presence felt protective in a way I wasn't used to. It was strange, even unsettling, how his concern highlighted the absence of such gestures in my marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. When he opened the passenger door, I hesitated. Getting into that car felt like stepping into an unspoken agreement, an acknowledgement that the night had taken a turn neither of us anticipated. Still, I climbed in, sinking into the seat with a sigh of both relief and tension. He closed the door gently, as though sealing the moment. Once inside, silence filled the space. The hum of the engine seemed louder than usual, and every glance in the rearview mirror carried weight. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to look composed even as my head swam. He drove cautiously, his eyes fixed on the road, yet I could sense the thoughts running through his mind. That drive wasn't long, yet it felt stretched, suspended in a bubble of unspoken words. It wasn't just about getting me home safely anymore. It was about navigating an invisible line neither of us had expected to find ourselves near, a line we both knew we shouldn't cross. The car hummed softly as we pulled away from the quiet street. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, hoping it would steady the dizziness clouding my mind. The city lights blurred into streaks of color, and for a moment, I felt as though I were drifting through a dream. Yet the silence inside the car kept me awake, heavy with thoughts neither of us dared to voice. I stole a glance at him, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. His expression was steady, almost guarded, but his grip on the steering wheel betrayed a subtle tension. He wasn't just driving me home, he was navigating something far more delicate. I could feel it in the way he avoided looking directly at me, as though one glance too long might suggest something neither of us wanted to confront. The alcohol loosened my tongue, and against my better judgment, I spoke. "You didn't have to do this," I murmured, my words slurred but soft. I could have figured it out. My attempt to sound independent only made me feel more exposed. He kept his eyes on the road and replied, "It wouldn't have been safe. You shouldn't be out here alone like this." Something about his tone, calm, almost protective, made me bite back the tears that threatened to surface. I had grown so accustomed to being overlooked, to carrying my own weight without complaint, that his simple act of care felt foreign. I wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in my throat. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence became unbearable, so I filled it with fragments of honesty I might have kept hidden on any other night. "Your father, he works too much," I said quietly, staring at the blur of headlights outside. "Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a shadow." The words slipped out before I could stop them, raw and unpolished. He shifted slightly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't interrupt. He simply listened. That, in itself, felt like a gift I hadn't realized I needed. My drunken honesty spilled further. I admitted how lonely I felt, how the house never felt like a home, how I had once dreamed of something more. With every confession, I expected judgment or dismissal, but he remained silent, letting me speak until my voice softened to a whisper. When I finally fell quiet, the only sound was the steady rhythm of the tires against the road. He cleared his throat softly before saying, "You shouldn't carry that by yourself." His words weren't dramatic, just simple and sincere. And yet, they struck me harder than any declaration could have. As we neared home, I realized the night had shifted into unfamiliar territory. This was no longer just about a drunk woman being driven safely back to her house. It was about two people bound by circumstance, suddenly seeing each other in a different light. The car became a fragile space, one where honesty hovered close to crossing lines, but restraint kept us from tumbling further. The drive ended sooner than I expected, yet the silence inside the car made it feel as though we had traveled miles beyond familiar ground. When he finally pulled up to the house, I sat there for a moment, hesitant to move. The porch light glowed dimly, casting long shadows across the front steps, and I realized how empty the house looked. My husband's car wasn't in the driveway. Once again, he was absent, caught up in the world of endless work, while I stumbled home under the care of someone who wasn't supposed to hold that responsibility. He stepped out first and came around to open my door. The gesture, simple as it was, sent a strange ripple through me. I was used to handling things myself, brushing off discomfort, keeping my head high even when I felt small. But tonight, I was too unsteady to pretend. I accepted his hand, though I tried to disguise my dependence as just another polite courtesy. His grip was firm but careful, as though he was afraid of crossing an invisible line yet unwilling to let me fall. The night air was cool, and the faint smell of damp earth clung to the garden. Each step toward the door felt heavier than it should, not because of the alcohol, but because of the weight of the situation. He carried my bag without being asked, setting it down neatly by the door. When I fumbled with my keys, he took them gently, his movements unhurried, as though he had all the patience in the world. The click of the lock breaking open felt like the breaking of a barrier I had carefully maintained for years. Inside, the house was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that amplifies every small sound, the shuffle of shoes on the floor, the thud of my bag against the wall, the quickened rhythm of my own breathing. He guided me to the couch, placing a glass of water on the table after noticing how dry my throat must have felt. It was a small act, yet it carried more care than I was accustomed to receiving in my own marriage. I sank into the cushions, closing my eyes for a moment, half in relief, half in shame. He stood nearby, not too close, his posture uncertain. He seemed to wrestle with the decision of whether to leave immediately or stay until he was sure I was all right. His eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a restraint that I couldn't ignore. "Thank you," I whispered, the words breaking through the tension. He nodded, his expression softening for just a heartbeat before hardening again with caution. That night, on the doorstep and within the quiet walls of my home, I felt a shift, something fragile, dangerous, yet undeniably real. It wasn't attraction in its purest form, but a recognition. Recognition of my loneliness, his awareness of it, and the dangerous closeness that simple kindness can create when hearts are already vulnerable. The glass of water sat untouched on the table as I leaned back against the couch, trying to gather myself. The room swayed faintly, but it wasn't just the alcohol, it was the way the night had unfolded, the way his presence filled a silence that usually felt unbearable. He lingered by the door, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, clearly torn between leaving and staying. I could see it in his eyes, the struggle to balance duty with discomfort. "Sit down," I murmured, surprising even myself. My voice was softer than I intended, almost pleading. He hesitated, then slowly lowered himself into the chair across from me, keeping a cautious distance. For a long moment, we sat without speaking, the quiet between us heavy, yet not empty. It was the alcohol that loosened my guard, but deep down I knew these words had been waiting to escape. "I don't know when it happened," I began, staring at my hands. But somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a wife. I started feeling like a shadow in my own home. My voice trembled, but I pushed on, afraid that if I stopped, the weight in my chest would crush me. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer false comfort or quick solutions. He simply listened, his silence a kind of acceptance I hadn't felt in years. That simple act, the patience to hear me, broke something inside me. The tears I had been holding back slipped free, and I wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. "You don't have to tell me this," he said gently, his tone careful, as though stepping through a minefield. But his eyes betrayed something else, compassion, perhaps even sorrow for me. "I know," I whispered, my voice cracking. "But I don't have anyone else to tell." The admission hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. I wasn't asking for him to fix anything. I wasn't even sure why I was confessing to him of all people. Maybe because, in that moment, he felt like the only person who truly saw me. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, and for a fleeting second, our eyes locked. There was no judgment in his gaze, only an understanding that made me feel both comforted and dangerously exposed. The line between honesty and vulnerability blurred, and I found myself teetering at the edge of something that both terrified and tempted me. The silence stretched again, this time charged with an unspoken tension. I could feel it, the possibility of crossing into territory that could never be undone. He must have felt it too, because he sat back quickly, creating space again, as though reminding himself of where we stood. That night wasn't about confessions of love or reckless choices. It was about the fragile honesty that comes when walls are lowered, when loneliness finds a listener. And in that moment, I realized how dangerous it was to be heard, because once you are, silence never feels the same again. The room had settled into an uneasy calm, but beneath it, tension rippled like an undercurrent waiting to pull us under. I sat curled on the couch, my hands clasped together tightly, as though holding on to something solid would keep me from slipping further into vulnerability. Across from me, he sat stiffly, his posture straight, his eyes darting anywhere but directly at me. Yet every few seconds, his gaze returned, only to retreat again as if burned by its own boldness. The silence grew unbearable, thick with things neither of us should say. I reached for the glass of water he had placed before me earlier, my fingers trembling slightly. As I drank, I caught his eyes lingering on me, not with judgment, but with something harder to define, something restrained, almost protective, yet edged with curiosity. That look alone made my heart pound in a way I didn't expect. I set the glass down, exhaling softly. "It's strange," I whispered, more to myself than to him, "to feel safer with you tonight than with the man I married." The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. His head lifted, his expression tightening as though he wasn't sure he had heard me correctly. For a second, the air between us seemed to snap, sharp and electric. He leaned forward slightly, not enough to invade, but enough to close the gap of distance. His voice was low, deliberate. "You shouldn't say things like that." It wasn't anger, it was warning. And yet, despite his caution, neither of us moved away. The space between us seemed to shrink, pulled by something invisible and dangerous. My pulse quickened, not just from the alcohol, but from the undeniable awareness of him. I could feel it, the possibility of a moment that would cross every boundary, a moment we could never take back. His eyes met mine again, steady now, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though time had frozen. I don't know who moved first, perhaps it was only the illusion of closeness, but suddenly, it felt as though we were leaning toward one another. My breath caught, the room spinning with more than just wine. There was a softness in his expression, a hesitation that mirrored my own conflict. It was a second stretched into eternity, a second where one decision could unravel everything. But then, just as quickly, he pulled back. The chair scraped faintly against the floor as he leaned away, running a hand over his face as though to wipe away the temptation. His exhale was heavy, controlled. "I should go," he muttered, his voice tight. The spell was broken. The fragile thread that had tied us in that moment snapped, leaving behind only silence and the pounding echo of what almost happened. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat dry. He stood, gathering himself, his movements brisk, almost mechanical, as though retreating was the only way to preserve what little was left unbroken. That night ended without a kiss, without a touch, but with something perhaps even heavier, the memory of a line we had nearly crossed, and the unspoken knowledge that we both felt it. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains, harsh and unwelcoming against my tired eyes. My head ached with the dull reminder of too much wine, but it was not the hangover that made me feel heavy, it was the memory of the night before. I sat up slowly, pressing my palms against my temples, replaying the fragments in my mind, the drive, the confessions, the silence, and that split second where the air between us had grown dangerously thin. The house was still quiet, though I knew my husband had already left for work. He always did, his early mornings as consistent as his late nights. But this time, the silence wasn't just emptiness. It was filled with echoes of what had almost happened, with the weight of eyes that had looked too deeply into mine. I forced myself out of bed and into the kitchen, where the remnants of last night remained, the empty glass of water, the faint imprint of footsteps near the door. Proof that he had been here. Proof that I hadn't dreamed it. My stomach twisted with embarrassment. What did he think of me now? Drunk, emotional, spilling secrets I had never meant to share. Worse, had he seen the weakness in me, the way my loneliness had stretched into something reckless? Later that morning, I heard the sound of the front door open. My pulse quickened instantly. It wasn't my husband. I knew his rhythm, the hurried way he entered. This was different, slower, hesitant. And then I saw him. My husband's son, standing there, as composed as always, though his eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of discomfort. Our gazes met, and for a moment, I wanted to disappear. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. He broke the silence first, offering a simple, almost rehearsed line. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." His voice was polite, detached, as though wrapping the memory of last night in a neat box and sealing it away. I nodded quickly, avoiding his eyes. "I'm fine. Thank you for everything." My voice faltered at the last words. He gave a brief smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes, then looked away. The distance between us felt wider now, not because we hadn't crossed the line, but because we had come so close. He kept his tone light, his words careful, but his posture carried restraint, a clear decision to put a wall back up. When he left, the house felt even emptier than before. I stood at the window, watching him walk away, my chest heavy with a mix of relief and regret. Relief that nothing had happened. Regret that something had nearly happened at all. The rest of the day passed in a blur, every sound amplified, every thought circling back to the same truth. There was no going back to how things had been. We had seen too much of each other's vulnerability, and no polite smile could erase that knowledge. That morning taught me something I couldn't ignore. The most dangerous secrets are not the ones we keep from others, but the ones we reveal in moments of weakness. Days passed, but the memory of that night clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I went through the motions of daily life, cooking, cleaning, answering polite questions from neighbors, but beneath the surface, I carried the weight of what almost happened. Every time I looked at my husband, I felt a pang of guilt, not because I had betrayed him, but because I had come so dangerously close. And every time I caught even a glimpse of his son, that fragile moment between us replayed in my mind like a warning. It would have been so easy to bury the night completely, to pretend it was nothing more than a drunk woman needing a ride home. But I knew better. We both knew better. It was more than that. It was the kind of night that strips away pretense and reveals truths we spend years hiding. My truth was clear. I was lonely. I was hurting. And I had found comfort, if only for a few hours, in the one person I should have kept at arm's length. At first, I feared what he might say, what he might tell his father. But he never spoke of it. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet restraint, as though the night had never happened at all. He smiled when necessary, offered polite conversation when we crossed paths, but the distance was unmistakable. He had made a choice that night, a choice to walk away, to protect both of us from something we could never undo. For that, I felt both grateful and ashamed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that night was less about him and more about me. It was a mirror, forcing me to face the cracks in my marriage, the emptiness I had tried so hard to ignore. I had been living as though love were optional, as though companionship didn't matter, but the truth was undeniable. I longed for connection, for someone to see me, to hear me, to care. And if I could feel that hunger so strongly in the presence of my husband's son, then something was deeply wrong at the core of my marriage. I didn't tell my husband about that night. Not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because it wasn't about betrayal. It was about realization. Instead, I began to ask myself harder questions. Did I want to keep living in the shadow of a man who was always absent? Did I want to keep waiting for something that was never coming back? The answers weren't easy, but they were necessary. In the end, the lesson was clear. Temptation doesn't always announce itself with passion or desire. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as kindness, creeping into the empty spaces of your heart. And if you aren't careful, it can pull you into places you never meant to go. That night with my husband's son didn't change who I was, but it forced me to see who I had become. A woman too lonely, too vulnerable, and too in need of honesty. And while we never crossed the line, I will always remember how close we came, and how that fragile moment became the turning point I could no longer ignore. 69.